Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, a podcast where we discuss books that are about archaeology but anyone can enjoy. I'm your host, Tristan Herenstein, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hello, everybody.
And this week we're finishing up Four Lost Cities, A Secret History of the Urban Age by Annalee Newitz. This section focuses on the North American city, Cahokia. I may confuse that with, or misspeak and say Cahokia at some point this time. I'll try and keep on top of that.
I'll try and keep you on track, Tristan.
Yeah. Before we get started, I want to thank everyone for tuning in and listening to our podcast. If you like what you hear, please consider giving us a 5-star review and a comment. Or if you're watching this on YouTube or on Spotify video, please like, subscribe, or whatever is appropriate for your platform. It really helps us, gives us some good feedback on what people think, and we appreciate it. So just kind of a quick recap for everyone. The first section we did on this book, with the first about 3 chapters, was about Cahokia. Then we moved to Pompeii and then Anchor, and now we're finishing up the book with Cahokia, not to be confused with Cahokia. This is a little more exciting to me in some ways. I liked the other ones, especially Anchor, because I knew so little about them. This one I actually have at least some knowledge, so it's kind of exciting to get in and just see how she's presenting it and kind of learning new things about it too.
And you have visited this site, right?
I have actually been to Monk's Mound, which we'll talk about. I have actually done some archaeology work on pre-Mississippian sites as well, which is kind of fun. So yeah, not that I am an expert in any of this, to be clear. I have just done the grunt work.
I tried to visit Cahokia, but as you know, my travel luck is less than stellar, and I didn't make it there. Planes got mixed up and flights got canceled.
This is a trend.
Yes, unfortunately. Hey, y'all. This is future Barbara here speaking with you. So as I was kind of looking at the book, I looked on the back, and Annalee Newitz, we've been referring to Annalee as a she. We like to be respectful of everybody's pronouns, and it came to my attention that Annalee prefers they. And so we do apologize. We obviously did not do that on purpose, but we just wanted to make a note of it so that we can do better. And we will definitely do more research on our authors in the future as well. So just wanted to make a note, and we are very sorry.
So for those who are not aware, which this really is kind of one of the little known sites in the Americas, and it really shouldn't be, because it's kind of on the scale of like what we think of as the big civilizations in the Americas, like the Aztec, Maya, Inca, and others as well. And we actually had some of this here in North America, and this is what the Mississippians were. So the capital city of Cahokia is located in under East St. Louis right now. Basically, that's built on top of it. That is a trend we see quite often in the past and now. Good places to build a city thousands of years ago are often good places to build a city today. So that is not an unusual thing to see happen.
Right.
So the chapter starts with kind of some scene setting. You know, this is in the Mississippi River Basin, the floodplains, where it's very rich, fertile soil. And she describes kind of what the place would have looked like and kind of sets the scenes for what she's going to present is the archaeological site. Things like ceremonial poles on top of the mounds. These are huge expanse of various sized mounds all over the place.
Some of the size comparisons, I think, are pretty extraordinary. And also the population.
Right.
You know, she mentions that this is the largest pre-Columbian city in what is now North America, and it was bigger than Paris at that time. I think it was like 30,000 people at its apex around 1050. That's amazing.
Yeah. No, it was a huge city. And people came from all over the continent, basically, to visit this place. Maybe not as far west, but all the way from the Gulf Coast. People were traveling from Texas. They found signs that people were traveling to this city to visit it.
Yeah, she describes it as a immigration sanctuary, which I think is an interesting way to describe it.
Yep. And then she starts talking a bit about Monk's Mound, which we talked about a little bit. And it is a huge earthen mound. The footprint is comparable to the Pyramid of Giza. It's not as high because it's made of soil, but the footprint is similar.
I think she says it's 30 meters tall, though. That's still pretty impressive.
Right. Although if you do go visit, it's important to be aware that it is reconstructed. that is not something that she mentioned, but it's something that I knew. It was seriously degraded and partially farmed under by the time it was bought by I think the state. At the time, that was a period where they did a lot of reconstruction, so they have rebuilt it, which has the benefit that you can get a really impressive idea of how big it is. And you can go and look up video, or probably videos, but photos of this kind of thing online. But I'll tell you right now, it doesn't have near the impressiveness of visiting it yourself. Just something about it, you don't really grasp how huge this thing is until you are there. So I recommend it. If you can get there, check it out. So it was a giant mound. The southern slope of the mound had 3 different levels. Each had ceremonial buildings on it. And speakers would stand on the levels to be heard in the 1 kilometer long Grand Plaza, which she gives an example of how big this was. Do you remember what that was, Barbara, right now?
I have in my notes because there's no way I can remember all these statistics, but the plaza was considered like the heart of the city.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important to note too that there were like other mounds around the area that were kind of scattered over multiple kilometers. But she does mention that the plaza was covered in gravel and kind of kept clean. I don't have anything about the size of the plaza.
I think I have that somewhere else, so that's fine.
Okay.
Approximately 38 American football fields. There it is. It was a little further down than I thought it was.
I see it in my notes now that you said that. Yes.
So it gives you an idea of just how massive this area was. And you mentioned the other mounds around, and from my understanding is, at least at certain points in the history of the city, the organization of it operated a lot like in Anchor, where they would have a temple as a focus and the neighborhood centered around that temple. And so that was similar with the other mounds and the plazas associated with those mounds, is it was kind of the central for individual communities or neighborhoods essentially within the city.
Yeah, the way I imagined it as she was talking about it was essentially like you did different neighborhoods or kind of enclaves within the bigger city of Cahokia. So you had other smaller mounds that acted as temples for that smaller group of people, and they may have had, a smaller plaza associated with that mound. But obviously Monk Mound is like the city center, essentially.
Yes. And I have a quote here. It was all aligned to a north-south grid, again, only at certain points. She doesn't clarify that at this point. She does go into that detail later, which I appreciate. But she says, all this suggested to visitors that the city was inhabited by not just people, but by otherworldly presences who came from realms above and below the human world. Now, as you know, Barbara and I are always a little kind of, where does this information come from? And I have to say, in this case, I did look it up, and it looks like a lot of this is coming from a study that she is referring to. And that study is pulling from the archaeology, but also from studies and accounts and anthropology studies of existing Native American cultures.
Yeah, what I really liked about reading this portion of the book is I was at one time heavily involved with a Southeastern Native American group, the Muskogee, or Creek, as a lot of people know them. And so when I was reading some of what she was talking about as far as like the cosmology and things like that, I can recall certain ceremonies that I was a part of or observed that had hints of this in it. And so it was really cool to read this and then see how it has carried on into modern day Native American culture. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through.
Good. I'll look forward to hearing what you know about that. I had some questions.
I may not have the answers, though, but I will try my best.
Understood. Oh, I will also add that the study she's referencing, at this point at least, seems to rely heavily on what we call landscape archaeology, which is essentially a look at how humans influence the landscape and how the landscape influenced human culture. And you mentioned the gravel on the plaza and everything, and she makes a careful note that it was kept extremely clean. And this is actually cool because we have seen examples of this firsthand. There is actually a mound, a Mississippian era mound here in our area around Tallahassee called the Letchworth Love Mounds Archaeological State Park, I think is the full name. And there was an archaeological investigation in that a little while ago looking for the settlement, but we were out there when they were actually trying to investigate the plaza. In this case, the doctoral student from University of Michigan, Martin Menz, and he did a geophysical survey using things like GPR or magnetometer like we've talked about in the past, and found some anomalies in the plaza, which is exciting because what's going on there? That's a very rare thing to find. So he dug down and investigated it and found that it was actually a much more modern event. So a farmer who had been using this area at one point, so it was some burned piles from that or something, not from the area he was looking for. And what he did find was absolutely nothing. They found 0 artifacts from the era they were looking for, which again tells you how impeccably clean these places were kept. It is really kind of fascinating. Well, so it was disappointing for him to not have the exciting new thing he was looking for. It was still useful because it confirmed what we have seen in other places.
Even negative data is data.
Yes, even though it makes us a little sad sometimes.
Well, I know at Mission San Luis, which is a Spanish settlement, it's a mission site, the Appalachee, which are essentially descendants of the Mississippian culture, they had a plaza there as well. And this is a little different because it's a Spanish mission site. But I believe it was they found something very similar where they didn't find much within the plaza itself. And most of it was, where people's homes were or where ceremonial buildings were. In this case, there was a fort and a church and all that kind of stuff too. Oh, I think it's important to mention too, like we're talking about this huge mound and all these other mounds are surrounding it. There were borrow pits. Obviously, they were gathering, the soil and the clay for these pits or for these mounds from somewhere. And it's been hypothesized that they were lined with clay. And so they were actually storing water in them. And this is something that we saw, like Angkor, for example. Storage of water is,
I think, on a smaller scale than that was.
Much smaller, yeah. I would imagine. But
I don't think it was as necessary either as Angkor. They didn't have the serious flooding
and they were within a river delta. So, yeah. But I just thought it was interesting because I know, for example, at Lake Jackson Mounds, there's, I think, which is another state park here that's actually Mississippian era mounds. And these mounds, of course, have been heavily looted and destroyed. But I've walked around there and I've found like smaller pits and there's no interpretation. So I don't know if these pits are borrow pits or just naturally formed kind of ponds or something, but it would be interesting to know because the sand has to come from somewhere.
Right. When talking about how the courtyards were the public sphere for sharing ideas and shaping ideas of what the city was, how it run and everything, she does say it's something like the history houses in Cahokia, the streets in Pompeii, and the temple complexes in Angkor. And I want to make it clear that she's highlighting this, I think, because it has kind of been the focus, but these were not the only ways these civilizations, these cultures did this kind of thing. This is just one of the more prominent ones maybe, or the ones that we've been able to study more thoroughly. Don't think it is just these one things where was the key for this civilization, because they were far more complicated than that.
I do think it's important that she does talk a little bit about the naming of the site and the culture. They didn't have writing. We don't know what these individuals would have called themselves or what they would have called themselves as a group. For all we know, there may have been different groups with different names that came together at this site. We don't know for sure. We call the site Cahokia, named after the Native Americans that were in the area. But interestingly enough, the Native Americans that are Cahokian don't actually claim this site to be one of theirs. And Mississippian simply comes from the fact that this site and sites like it are located along the Mississippi River in the Mississippi River Valley. So
basically a very important highway. You can think of it that way.
Yeah. So I always think it's important to note that the names we've given sites and artifacts and things like that don't necessarily reflect what the people of that time would have called it.
This is similar with Cahokia, for example, and we've had other cases where we've brought that up too.
Yeah.
And then she kind of ends with this section with the idea that is kind of the premise for this. Eventually, the city was abandoned, and we don't really know all the details of why, but it's important to think of this as not a failure or loss. This is just an expected part of the cycle of a city. And that's kind of the overarching theme with all of these cities, is that they have traditionally been presented as lost or destroyed. There are elements of it that persist or just change into something else. They're not gone.
And what's fascinating about Cahokia is that archaeologists have found remains of foundations and trash pits and all sorts of things that make them think that Cahokia may have been designed from the beginning to be somewhat temporary. Like they knew it had essentially a life cycle. And I think that's just an interesting way to think of a settlement, because that's not really how we think of it in today's terms. So it's just very different from our modern perspective.
What we do know of the start of Cahokia, it started in the late 900s. And a lot of what we have on this founding is based off of oral histories as well as some observations by early Europeans.
And I think it's important to note too that, just to give it a little bit of context, that around 900, Europe was in the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that helps people kind of contextualize what time period we're talking about and what was going on in the broader world.
And so it was founded by leaders promising spiritual and cultural rebirth. This is, again, based off of these oral traditions that we've found. And a lot of what inspired this civilization or this city, there's actually millennia of mound building that's happened. I mentioned during my first field school, I actually worked on what we call a Hopewell mound site. And looking back especially, it was cool. At the time, I don't think I fully understood or appreciated how cool it was. Yeah, so there's a long tradition of this, and they would have seen these mounds, understood them. Some of them were likely holy sites, I would guess.
Yeah, and she does a pretty good job of introducing the broader framework of mound building and pre-Mississippian culture. She talks a little bit about like Poverty Point and some of the earlier mounds. So yeah, these people would have been very attuned to mound building. I did think it was interesting that she mentions that there could have been influence by contemporary pyramids in like South and Central America, like the Mayan and Toltec.
She didn't necessarily mean pyramids, right? She meant cities, metropolises.
Yeah. But that's something that's been kind of a hot debate among archaeologists on and off throughout the last 10 or so years. And I didn't look in her references to see if she had any specific studies that pointed to that. But just so people are aware, there has been a lot of people that see similarities in the cultures, and people wonder how that happened and why that happened and so on and so forth.
And not being heavily involved in that debate myself, from what I do know of like how extensive the trade networks were at the time, it doesn't seem unreasonable. Like they've found obsidian from Mexico in this area. So the trade networks were there.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not too far-fetched to think that because we're connected by land to South and Central America, and so trade would be relatively easy. And even if you say that they possibly traveled along the water, the Gulf of Mexico, as far as waterways, and especially saltwater ocean waterways, is pretty navigable, especially if you were kind of hopping along the coast or something. So it's definitely plausible, I would say, but I haven't done a ton of research on it myself.
Sure. And like Anchor, the city also was, we mentioned it was built around a kind of this case, a mound and a courtyard complex, but also it is interspersed with farms, just like with Anchor. And it's also important to note that the fact that it looked so different from what a European would consider a city is part of the reason there was so much difficulty in recognizing it as such a huge city. I say part of the reason because part of the reason, again, like Anchor, there was some, let's say, political motivation to denying its importance, its value, and who could have built it. And we've talked about that last time a little bit, and we'll probably talk about it again. But yeah, so just kind of be aware of that too.
Well, and similarly, like Angkor, Cahokia, she was talking about how other sites around the area have similar architectural features. And she was postulating, I guess, whether similar to Angkor, Cahokia could have had farther reaching influence into other areas extending beyond Cahokia itself as far as architecture and bureaucratic influence and things like that. So it's just interesting to see how...
I feel like that's pretty well supported.
Yeah.
How much is a good question, but just we talked about Letchworth Love Mound down here and how much similarity there was, at least in some key details.
Yeah, Letchworth, Lake Jackson, Lake Jackson had a plaza as well.
Mm-hmm.
Lake Jackson's just an interesting site to me because half of it's, or about some of it, I don't know exactly if it's half disappeared. And we'll come back to that when we talk a little bit about what's happened to some at Cahokia too. Because it was a trend.
Definitely. It's also important to remember that we tend to look at the giant stone structures and think, oh my gosh, what amazing amount of work this must have taken. But actually, and it's easy to look at the mounds of dirt and like, it's just a pile of dirt, what's the big deal? But actually, it was still a massive amount of work. You think of the technology at the time, there were no beasts of burden, there was no wheel. Every bag of soil was carried on in baskets on people's backs. All the digging was done using stone tools like basically a hoe, and it had to be carried from wherever they're getting it to the mound. And they weren't just digging any soil too. There was intentional, like different kinds of soil had different kinds of meaning, but there's also a understanding of how different soils eroded differently. And there was actually a structure built. This was very technologically advanced, and the organization involved in this is just mind-boggling.
Did you catch the part where she was talking about how archaeologists could see the actual like various piles of dirt that were piled on top of each other because it was so tightly packed? They can actually see the little different mounds from each basket load that was poured on top of each other.
I have actually seen that myself in the Hopewell site I mentioned, which of course is much older than this even. But
very cool.
It's cool. It's like a person 1,000+ years ago, whatever you're looking at, carried this basket of soil. That's just kind of amazing.
Yeah.
And I think like this is a good opportunity to kind of remind people of why looting is such a hazard to archaeology, because people who are looting a site are looking for the pretty things, and things like a basket of soil that you can recognize is not something they're looking for, even that they would necessarily recognize as important. But when they are digging for the pretty things, they are destroying all this other evidence along the way.
No, and I think that's important to note too, because archaeology is about the people. And what is more individualistic or personal than imagining the labor that went into that one individual basket? This person didn't just do one individual basket, they did basket upon basket upon basket. And I think it adds a little bit of humanity to it.
And on the baskets too, there was a little bit, this is where I start to kind of ask a little questions about where some of the information comes from, because in this case, the author said that perhaps this work may have been ritualistic. And I'm like, well, maybe, but how do we have any indication of that? I always wonder this kind of thing.
Yeah, and I know she went in when she was talking about the labor and the reason behind it or the purpose. She also talks about the debt slaves again.
Yeah.
And there's no evidence for that whatsoever at this site. I know she's trying to make a comparison, but I feel like if you're going to make a comparison, there has to at least be some evidence.
And this is on the opposite side of the world.
Right. Yeah.
At a different time, different culture. Yeah. The idea that they would have the same system is maybe a little hard to grasp.
And I know that might be us nitpicking, but I think it's really important to point out to somebody else who may read this book, because I don't want them to get it in their minds that that's a direct comparison based on evidence.
Well, and you may pick up that we're a little more sensitive to this kind of thing in this section, just because we are trained as North American archaeologists, and there is a very kind of fraught history with archaeology and, let's say, Native American interests. And there have been a lot of abuses by Europeans and archaeologists in the past. These things are getting better, but we are still working on correcting a lot of these things. So we're a little more sensitive to this particular case than we were with cases where we don't have as much of that background personally. We do talk a little about Ramey pottery, which that stuff's cool.
That is really cool. And I, of course, had to refresh my memory on Ramey pottery because it's been a while. I think that was undergrad for me. And it's fascinating, especially just to me, just the shape of the vessels, the jars, what they call jars, where the rim actually comes in towards the center and you can look down on the pot and see the entire motif from above. It's just, first of all, I've made pottery before and I always made it on a pottery wheel. So to imagine them trying to make this with the coil method, I don't know how it didn't fall in on itself. And then to fire it and have it survive all that. I mean, just the understanding of their resources and the artisanship is amazing to me.
And so this pottery, along with figurines, decorative projectile points, and other things, they traveled around. Like people were apparently going there and getting them and then taking them home with them.
Which I just love that idea.
Yeah.
Because that's something we do today, right? When I travel, I collect magnets and, I have them all over my refrigerator. And it's just really cool to think that at this time period, people were collecting something from their pilgrimages or their travels to other places. And I don't know, it just adds a really cool human element to it again that I really like. But speaking of the pottery, I think it's important to note that with some of the other cities that we've studied, Pompeii, for example, was based on an economy, right? It had the rows of shops. It was, based on mercantilism. And this city, Cahokia, doesn't really seem to have that. There's no marketplace. There's no like centralized market area that they can speak of. And there's no, shop lined streets like Pompeii. And so it's more of archaeologists and others believe that it was more of like a spiritual center rather than like a trade-based center. Although obviously they were trading or at least taking some items from that.
Right. And I did note that the author said this was one of the interpretations, but then really no other interpretation was presented until a native author at the end kind of contested that idea.
Well, and I think also it's important to note that whole idea of a spiritual center centers all around the idea that it had to have a money-based economy, right? Like Rome had money. A lot of other civilizations had money. Trade doesn't necessarily necessitate money or coinage. And we know for a fact that they were taking this Ramey pottery away. And we also know, and we can talk about that later, that people were bringing in yopon leaves for black drink and things like that. So there was some trade. Now, whether or not that was the purpose of Cahokia is something to be discussed, I think.
Yeah. And how much of it and what it looked like, that was one thing that rankled me just a little bit because that author had a different interpretation, but it felt like the interpretation, or at least this native individual, was kind of just an afterthought rather than, probably felt like it should have had a little more weight to it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Next,
we move on to the game of Chunky, if I'm saying that right. You know, Barbara?
Yes, that's right.
You know this game, by the way?
So the Muskogee played stickball. They didn't play Chunky, so I'm not familiar with this, but stickball has, I guess, some similar kind of ceremonial connotations. I just thought it was interesting how it seems that a lot of these big ceremonial events involve gaming, which what I was told about stickball and the way they play it, at least with the group I was part of, is men against women. And it is a way to kind of release your aggression, get out, have some physical activity, and it gets pretty violent.
Yeah.
But it was scary at times, but it was a lot of fun in a controlled way with minimal rules, really. But it was a way to kind of get all that out, and then it's done with, it's over with, you move on. And I thought it was interesting. And she didn't really talk about that with Chunky, but she did talk about how it relied on a lot of audience participation and also gambling,
right?
Which I guess is a big part of it. But I'm not super familiar with this. I do think it's interesting how the Chunky pucks became art like themselves. They were carved and adorned, and people would collect them. And it's neat because I can kind of equate that with people that like play sports today. You have your tennis racket and it's taped for your hand, and people have their special sports equipment. I mean, I ride dressage and we're like the fanciest athlete adorners ever. So it was kind of cool to see like, oh, wow, people have always wanted to kind of individualize their sporting equipment, I guess.
Based off of the description in the chapter, the way this sport worked was you'd have people with spears lined up and someone would roll a stone disc and everyone would throw their spear while it's rolling, basically. And whoever was closest to where the disc ended up would be the winner. So,
yeah, as I was reading the description, I immediately thought of bocce ball.
That does sound a little familiar, yeah.
Yeah.
If you want further description of it, though, I will say the wiki article on Chunky has very good description of it, although you will probably note the term fall of the Mississippian culture within that article.
No, they're still around in some form or another. Come on.
Right, which is kind of what we're trying to talk about with this book in general.
Yeah. Did the article mention if anybody still plays Chunky? Because I know a lot, stickball is still played.
It's been a couple weeks since I looked at it. I feel like there was some modern elements they talked about. There's like a section about modern use and that kind of thing.
Yeah, okay, because I know at Moundville, they have a Native American festival. This is in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And they always have the local Choctaw, I believe, which is another Native American group, play against the local college's anthropology club with stickball. As you can imagine,
Yeah.
the nerds get creamed every year. I mean, I think the Choctaw are like reigning, or at least at the time when I went, they were like reigning national stickball champions. And then you had like the anthropology club come out and play against them. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I hope there's an ambulance nearby.
I've heard stories of archaeologists playing against the native tribes, and they do not hold back from what I understand. Like you said, the chance to work out some aggression.
Right.
And we talked about how there's
true.
kind of a long problematic history. I have avoided having to do that myself, though. Sounds painful.
I've played stickball.
Right. But they're going to be nicer to you, as I understand it, right? Wasn't there a gender, like, with what you've done, there was a gender, like, how you treat each other?
Yeah. I mean, I still got scratches, bumps, bruises, thrown around a little bit, but it was a lot of fun. But I do recall them telling me that in past games, they've had to call an ambulance out. So maybe I got lucky.
Or maybe they were telling you stories.
Maybe.
I wouldn't put it past it, though, from what I hear of that. So another big feature of celebrations was festivals. So giant group meals, and this incorporated, of course, the main plaza, but all the other little plazas too. And we find all kinds of, like, basically heaps of garbage pits from these festivals.
Which archaeologists love garbage, you guys.
All about garbage, yeah.
Yes.
A whole variety of animals. I thought this was a little odd because the author says even swan, which...
I thought that I even made a note because I was like, I don't understand how that is. The only thing I can get is like the colonial implications. A lot of us, you may be familiar with like the swans, and I know you've talked about
last time, yeah.
And so, yeah, she was like, even swans. And I was thinking to myself, well, they're just another
bird.
Yeah.
Big
yeah.
bird.
We
They're
eat
like
chicken,
a goose,
we eat
basically.
duck, we
Right.
eat geese, but swans.
Right.
I picked up on that too, and I thought it was really...
I picked up on a few little elements of that throughout this section. So, yeah, definitely a little applying our thinking to a group where we shouldn't necessarily be applying that kind of thinking.
And I would try swan.
I would definitely try swan. And a part of this was the black drink, which is Barbara's main thing, I know.
Yes, I'm over here about ready to squeal, you guys. Yeah, so the black drink was a ceremonial drink that you find a lot of Southeastern Native American groups drinking. It comes from Yopon holly, which is a native holly, and it's actually the only native source of caffeine in North America. Its scientific name is very unfortunate. It is Ilex vomitoria. You got that right, vomitoria. Now, this is a really good example, and it kind of goes along with what you and I have been talking about this whole book. Europeans came to the Americas, and they saw Native Americans drinking this drink made from this holly, and they were vomiting. So they thought, oh, it must be the black drink. But it wasn't necessarily the black drink. It wasn't the black drink at all. They didn't have the full understanding or the full picture of what was going on during these ceremonies. And these festivals, they would fast for days on end. They would be dancing around a fire. It was a festival. It was fun. And people were fasting, and it was ceremonial. And then they drank a whole bunch of this hot caffeinated tea on an empty stomach after, dancing around a fire for a little while. Yeah, they vomited. But it wasn't anything to do with any chemicals or anything like that in the plant. It had to do with the method in which they were drinking it and the context in which they were drinking it. And it's important to understand they were doing that on purpose. This was a ritual purging. So even today, people drink, black drink. It's holly. I have it in my yard. I've made this before, and I did not vomit.
No,
and it's actually the Spanish, when they found it hard to get coffee in Florida and in the Southeast, they took up drinking black drink as well. And you can find it even today, like in the Outer Banks. There's even companies in Florida that are starting to harvest it and sell it like online and stuff as a tea. it's really good. You can parch the leaves like in a cast iron skillet, or I've even done it in my air fryer and steep it like you would any tea, and then add your honey, your milk, your cream, sugar, whatever you want to it. And it's really delicious, and it does have caffeine. But no, unfortunately, the scientific name has stuck. And so people even today think it makes you vomit, or they think it's poisonous, and it's not. It's perfectly fine to drink.
And so I would like to know what you think of the book's description of this.
I mean, yeah, I wish she would have talked a little bit about the plant itself, because I feel like it's a very ceremonial drink, and it's the plant. And, there's a lot of ceremonial and religious connotations that go with this plant and the ritual purging and stuff like that. And she doesn't really touch on that. But I feel like you could write a book in and of itself on black drink. So that may have been a tangent that she avoided on purpose.
Well, and tell me what you think of this, of my take on this too, is that she mentions the vomiting, but she doesn't say it in a way that strictly says that the plant did it, but it is definitely implied the way it is worded. And
Yeah.
I wish that she had been a little more direct in that it was not actually the plant doing it, for example.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. I didn't really, I mean,
And she also calls it a hallucinogen.
yeah, which it's not.
Well, I looked this up, and all I could figure out was that technically caffeine could be considered a hallucinogen.
I guess, yeah.
But that is a very loaded term without more context. You've been better off just saying caffeine.
Yeah, it's not like ayahuasca or
Right.
something like that. That is most definitely, even
Right.
by modern day standards, a hallucinogen.
Well, I guess with like high amounts of caffeine, people can start to hallucinate, for example. But that is not, again, it's a very loaded term, and I wish that it had been presented a little differently in this case to give it a
Right.
little more.
Based on my experience, again, with modern day muskogee, they don't take hallucinogens or anything like that. The two plants I really saw them utilize the most was Yopon holly, Ilex vomitoria, and willow medicine. They would make essentially like liquid aspirin out of willow. And those were the two plants that I saw them utilize the most.
Mm-hmm.
And neither one of those are really what I would consider a hallucinogen. I mean, I know, yes, like you said, caffeine is a hallucinogen if taken in quantities, but I've drank black drink, and it's no more caffeinated than like tea you would buy, like Lipton or whatever, you buy at the store.
And so people came all over the continent basically for these festivals. And I thought this was really cool because in Cahokia, they found a projectile point carved in the style of the Texas area using Cahokian chert. So someone who knew the Texas style would have come to Cahokia and then made a point there, that's really cool evidence. I was not as wild about the Korean taco analogy. But then I realized I think it was just to set up a joke for projectile point fusion, which I kind of liked. So I'll forgive that analogy. I have some issues with other ones, but I think that was mostly to set up a joke. Like, okay.
Yeah, I think, it's harder when you're reading a book, and especially when you're reading a book, when you're making notes and things like that for a podcast, you're not reading it fast enough to really like hit on the joke.
Right.
So I think our readers, as they're reading through it, they might hit on the joke a little better than we did. Plus, we're being probably a little more critical than most readers.
We're being more critical than I normally would be reading this kind of thing, even. So.
Oh, and I want to circle back when we're talking about black drink to the Ramey pottery. And I was doing research on the Ramey pottery, and I found some isotope analysis, some chemical analysis of Ramey pottery. And guess what they found? They were making in some of the Ramey pottery.
What?
Black drink.
Oh, yes.
Yes. I was so excited about that. So I just had to share that.
Yeah. And then we have a quote kind of referencing what these festivals meant. And this is, I guess, a quick example of kind of where I was having a little issue with some of the analogies being drawn. We can't be sure if people attending them were experiencing something that medieval Europeans would have called church or something that contemporary Americans would have called a Star Wars movie. Most likely it was a bit of both, depending on the circumstances.
Right. And I think if I remember correctly, she was talking about like some of the shows about fertility and heroes and gods and stuff like that, which I experienced some of that, which was very entertaining. But yeah, I thought that again, just
Well, it's like these are the two extremes and everything else is somewhere in between them. Whereas like, why couldn't this be something else entirely? Like
I
using the European centric viewpoint here is not necessarily the best way of understanding what might have been going on, is kind of what I thought anyway.
Yeah, I found it a little insulting,
Yeah.
and just to be blunt. And I know I'm maybe overly sensitive about this because it is in North America. And like you said, we are archaeologists who understand the issues that we've had in the past. And also, I have participated in some of these ceremonies and things that derive from this culture. I don't think even modern day Native Americans would find this to be in good taste, to call it either church or a movie.
Or between the two.
Yeah, I feel like, and I get why she's trying to make comparisons, right? She's trying to make it relatable to the
Just trying to
reader.
help us
Yeah,
understand.
but I feel like it's sometimes they're just not necessary, or they're kind of in bad taste, to be
Yeah.
honest.
And
Yeah.
I was kind of like, well, this is something different, and this almost restricts what I'm thinking is going on.
Right. Yeah.
Even so,
Yeah, that's true.
I was a little disappointed, I guess.
Yeah.
Then we move to some large earthen platforms and the human sacrifices.
Which I have issues again with how she describes these human sacrifices in some
Same.
things. So they found human sacrifices and offerings, disinterred bones, some dead, which were reburied with more newly dead, and then they were covered with dirt. And she does mention that sacrifice may have been the norm. And then she goes on to discuss why sacrifice may have taken place. Which honestly, we may never know, right? You don't
Right.
necessarily have the archaeological evidence or the ethnographic evidence to put any of this in context.
There aren't any current cultures that practice
Right.
this, so
But she does equate it or compare it to public executions in Europe,
yeah.
but not necessarily of criminals that we know of. And I was like, what?
Well, and the implication, I think, too, was that this was a tool used by the elites to enact their power over other people, which
We don't know
where
that.
did we get that?
Yeah, we don't know that. Not necessarily here in the New World, but in other places, we have examples of people volunteering to be sacrificed. And I don't think, I know it goes against our norms, and it goes against our whole way of being as modern, Anglos or whatever. But to say that it was similar to a public execution, and to
It felt
even
sensational.
contemplate that it might have been like criminals.
Yeah.
That's just not.
It just felt very sensational too, and not. It didn't feel respectful. Like I think she wants to be and is trying to be. But I think this is a pretty major misstep.
Yeah,
essentially.
This one really rubbed me the wrong way, especially knowing how Native Americans have been portrayed in the past,
Right.
and how some people still today portray them. And to even put that in the minds of the reader just really rubbed me the wrong way.
And so I looked at her sources for this because, like we said, it rubbed me the wrong way. And the source definitely does identify some of these things as sacrifices, but again, does not try to guess what they meant to the people beyond some relatively surface level stuff. But with the one where she draws the death pit parallel, which we had problems with the death pit back in the Cahokia section too. And that one, I felt like the authors very carefully did not say that was a sacrifice. They didn't say either way, but the other ones, they said this was sacrifice, this was sacrifice. For this exact example, they did not say it was a sacrifice. And I think that was probably intentional. And so again, this, and when we come back to the sacrifice, is for me maybe a bit of a low point for the book, for where I'm feeling lowest about the book.
Same. I would definitely agree with that. This is not a reflection on the entire book. I enjoyed the book.
Overall, she's got some great ideas she's trying to talk about,
but
and she does talk about
this one point just hit me really hard the wrong way.
And again, remember, we know some about this already. We're a little extra sensitive to it. We're still dealing with the fallout of this past we're referring to. So keep that in mind, that, for us too.
Yeah, I don't want to harp on it too much. I just think it's really important to point out to our listeners, just because this is something that we really try to nip in the bud, essentially, and we're trying to change. the way we view Native Americans in North America.
Okay, then moving on. She then talks about how the city was laid out, which again, as we will get to, this was at what we define as the middle period for the city, when it was based on a north-south grid, but it was 5 degrees off. And I'm always a little leery of people talking about how things in ancient times aligned with the stars, because there's a lot of really non-scientific stuff. In this case, she was on, though. I'll give her credit. I looked at her sources, I looked things up, and she was doing a good job. Just to clarify, though, I felt like she talked about a thing called lunar standstill, which her definition is the moon's altitude in the night sky rises and falls dramatically during a 2-week period. That is actually kind of the opposite of what a lunar standstill is. So essentially, as the Earth tilts during the seasons, the moon will appear to swing south and then swing north and then back. When it's close to the middle is when it's moving the fastest, but lunar standstill happens when it's far north or far south, and it looks like its rate of change is slowing down and it's not moving anymore.
That
So
makes
it's
sense.
just so
Yeah.
you understand that it's not a big deal, but I felt like the description was maybe a little off or a little confusing, so I wanted to make sure that's clear to everybody. Does talk about the supernova in 1054 as may have been something that kind of sped up cattle hayek's growth, and it actually impacted cultures worldwide. And this supernova was close enough and so bright that at night it was bright as the full moon, which that must have been something to see.
I know. I was thinking to myself, wow, will that happen in my lifetime? Because
Yeah.
I would love to see that. I don't know what the implications are. I'm sure not great, but it would still be really
I think
cool.
don't know what that would do to our satellites and all
Yeah,
electronics.
that's what I was
and yeah,
thinking.
I wonder. I don't know. It may not do anything, but it might have different effects now.
Right.
But I
yeah.
still want to see it.
Right. Exactly. Me too.
And then we talk about stable isotopes again,
I know.
which is so cool.
Yeah, they were trying to discern how many people weren't native to Cahokia, and what was it? A third of the population, according to stable isotope analysis, were immigrants. They came from elsewhere. So I love this because it's just another example of how forensics and anthropology use the same scientific method. And yeah, it's just
And
cool.
what is stable isotopes again?
So this is where they would take, I think most of the time it comes from like the pulp and teeth. When you are growing up and you drink the water, eat the food that was grown in the ground and things like, and the animals that eat the plants that are grown in the ground, you absorb the minerals and nutrients from that specific area. And stable isotope analysis can analyze that stuff in your tooth pulp or, your bone marrow or wherever, and see what the what the ratio of different minerals and things like that are, and they can tell from that where you are from, which is so cool. And they do this in modern forensics, like if they find unidentified remains or something like that, they might do that to see.
I wonder how useful it is now, though, considering how much food is shipped around the world and everything, too.
Yeah, I don't know. I know I watch a lot of like crime dramas, and they use it, especially when talking about like human trafficking cases and things like that. But I don't know if they really do it in person. If anybody listening knows or works in that field, let us know. Drop a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
And next we move on to the crops and how the population sustained itself, essentially.
One of the most fascinating things to me is they didn't initially plant maize, or what we call corn.
Right.
And they relied on like other domesticated native plants, many of which I have never heard of before. In fact, I have a list and I don't recognize any of these names. Goosefoot, little barley, marsh elder, maygrass, erect knotweed. Not familiar with any of these plants.
Mm-hmm.
And I Googled some of them just to see what they looked like. And I think it's interesting because they're sometimes called lost crops because they were once farmed, and they kind of, selection grew them to have certain traits. And then they stopped growing them and they went wild again. And to me, I'm just like, wow, that's so weird. Can you imagine if that happened with like corn or wheat or something? What would it end up looking like? But they were able to selectively grow crops that had these like desirable characteristics, like thick or thin skins, depending on what the plant was. They wanted it to grow fast, large plump seeds, of course. And it's funny because now the wild versions don't look like that anymore. So they kind of reverted back to, I guess, what they looked like before they were being selectively domesticated or whatever you would say.
Did you also look up the Berger figurine she describes in this section?
I didn't look it up, or I saw a picture of it, but I thought it was really neat.
It is really cool.
Because you know how she said like traditional farmers still recognize it as grandmother or the old woman who never dies. Well, when I was, again, hanging with the creeks, I would hear some of the women talk about grandmother or Mother Earth, but not in the context, like hippy dippy context, like, within their context. And it was just cool because, so at least with what I'm familiar with, plants and gardening and things was kind of the women's realm and animals were the men's realm. And the way it was told to me is like Earth is a mother because she gives sustenance, right? And then it becomes the women's realm. And I just thought it was cool, like to see the connection between the Berger figurine and Cahokia and what these women were telling me and what they believe now and how they understand it. It was cool.
Yeah. So a quick description of what it is it's a carved figurine in a red chert stone, and it is a woman tilling a feline-headed serpent as the ground, and the tail goes behind her, and the tail transforms into gourds, and then she's got baskets of squash on her back. And I really recommend giving this a look up because it is a cool little figurine. I thought it was very powerful imagery.
Oh, another interesting thing that I just wanted to touch on quickly is, how a lot of us are taught or led to believe anyways that Native Americans had no concept of like land ownership, right? They were like ones with the earth and all that stuff. And a lot of that comes from a very Eurocentric and sometimes racist or otherwise, ulterior motives for thinking of Native Americans like that. There's the noble savage. And there's evidence at Cahokia that shows that family and other like extended kin groups, and I say extended kin groups because they may not have thought of family the same way we think of family, right? They were possibly clan, like, had clan affiliations and things like that. But that different groups held exclusive use rights to like demarcated plots of land and little farms and things like that. So I think it's just important to note that because, again, trying to stomp that noble savage myth into the ground.
And part of the issue with the noble savage myth, so everyone kind of aware too, and correct me if I've got this wrong or I'm missing something, Barbara, but essentially what it does is it kind of establishes Native American groups as not human or other than human.
Yeah.
And that's dangerous because then that kind of thinking has been used as an excuse for the way we've treated them in the past.
Yep.
So it is a good idea to be very conscious of that kind of thing and try and be aware of it because it's kind of everywhere. She starts to ask some questions. How did this function? Was it, people paying tribute or tax? And then she goes to the Stagger Inn.
Which, where else would you go to find archaeologists after a hot day of field work?
Especially at an archaeologist-owned bar.
I know, and I love that it's called the Stagger Inn.
Right. Right.
Why am I not surprised? That was what I wrote in my book.
Yeah.
But I thought the interactions she had with these archaeologists when she was asking some of the questions she was asking, her description of it was making me giggle just because I can imagine this. I think we have both probably been in similar situations at like conferences, or you and I deal with the public talking to some people and you get asked, the same question over and over again by somebody or different people. And you're just kind of like, oh, goodness. But it's important that people ask these questions.
It's important that we answer them too.
Yes, exactly.
Which they do.
So
they don't quite hide it very well, apparently. I thought this was important. So the answer she receives from the archaeologists is that this system sounds more like it was something that individual neighborhoods essentially worked out rather than an overarching organized system. And sometimes it feels like the author is presenting kind of a society that's not run by maybe a couple figureheads. And then sometimes it feels like they're presenting the exact opposite. Like there's some very totalitarian people. And maybe she's talking about different time periods, but I was not really clear on, I feel like there's a little contradictory is what it felt like to me, I guess.
In my mind, I kind of started to form this idea of essentially how, like, for example, a state works, right? You have, for example, Florida. We have Tallahassee, it's the state capital, right? But then we have all these other municipalities, counties, cities, whatever, and they can form their own rules as long as they kind of align with the larger rules. And I kind of started to get that kind of picture of what was maybe going on at Cahokia, but I could be completely off base. But in my mind, that's kind of how I was organizing it.
And so we close up the chapter with the ritual that is currently referred to by archaeologists. Remember, that's the term we call it now, is closing up house. And essentially, as Barbara's alluded to before, this was all seen as kind of temporary. So it felt a little like Cahokians abandoning their building and burning all their stuff and going.
Well, in this case, they were, ending the life of a house and then oftentimes building a new house on top of it.
Yeah, sometimes using the same post holes even.
Yeah, which it's, again, I know I keep talking a lot about my own personal experience, but I've gone to a ceremony, what the Muskogee call a busk, where it's kind of their New Year's celebration. And one of the things that we did was we would sweep up our house or vacuum our house, and we would take what they called the dregs. So like the stuff that is in your vacuum after you vacuumed, and we would take that and put it in the fire. And I was told it was to symbolize the burning of your house, because obviously today we can't burn our houses. Insurance companies would not like that.
Right.
And if you think of it, especially in the Southeast, it kind of makes sense, right? A lot of these were built with organic materials, at least partially. And I mean, we've lived in Florida long enough to know that palmetto bugs are called palmetto bugs for a reason, so it makes sense that after so long, you would be like, okay, we need to just scrap this house and kind of just start over.
Well, and wood just doesn't last more
Yeah.
than maybe 5 years and stuff.
I feel like a lot of times there's this intersection between what is practical and what is ceremonial, and they're kind of one and the same. But yeah, it was interesting. I mean, people would bring like their favorite coffee mug that they broke that year and put it in the fire and stuff. And and I asked, like, how long have you been doing this in this same fire? And they were like, since for, as long as we can remember. And I was like, oh, the archaeologist in me was like, what is in there? This has to be so cool.
Yeah. And then we end with a line. You might say that Cahokians believed their city was alive, but they also accepted that its lifespan was finite. I think it's an interesting idea, but I don't think I would say it with such certainty.
I thought a lot about this too, because I mean, even today, like when you build a house, you know the house is probably not going to last forever, right? But it's not something that when you're building the house, you necessarily take into consideration. So I don't know that you can say you would do that with a city either. They may have been accepting of the fact that may have had a finite time frame, or that it was going to degrade over time. But I don't know that you can say that they knew for certain.
That it was planned from the start.
Yeah.
The next chapter, the author starts talking about their experiences at Cahokia, and they actually visited the excavations for 2 summers. And based on her description, I wasn't sure if it was like the whole summer or just kind of visited for a bit. I think it sounded like she was there for a bit, but didn't, necessarily stay for the whole thing.
That's the impression I got as well, yeah.
But they're working on a site southwest of Monk's Mound, and they're investigating a residential neighborhood. In this case, they opened up a few trenches, and they were finding tons of ritual objects and feast items. And I feel like the author is sometimes struggling with the concept of they're not actually dead sometimes too, a little bit. Although in this case, it might be okay. Let me know what you think. Because in this case, they refer to this as this is all connected to the city's demise. But I guess the city did end, right? But that's kind of against some of the arguments, because there was still the mounds. There were probably still religious sites. So but as a city, maybe it did end.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, again, and one of the things she's kind of discussed in this book is how do you define a city, right?
Right.
And I mean, it still exists in some form or another. And I don't know, maybe some Native Americans do hold ceremonies there occasionally. And, it just depends on how you define it, I guess. But I think you're right. She's kind of struggling with that as well a little bit.
And you may hear us slip up actually as we're talking about it too. That's
Yeah.
very possible because it's so kind of built in that the city is gone. It is ended. It is no more. But the point is, and it might work in this case a bit more than other examples too, because the overall point for Cahokia is that it's the culture lived on, at least, maybe not the city. It doesn't really focus on what the city lived on in a different way, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyway, just I thought it was interesting because I know as I've been thinking about it and taking notes on it, I was like, wait a minute, that's not the right way of phrasing that, So I think very understandable, but I thought it was interesting, I guess.
I do kind of love her description and of her experience with archaeologists.
Yeah.
There was a lot in there that I enjoyed as an archaeologist when she was discussing like how to keep cool in the heat in an excavation. It reminded me of your straw hat, Tristan.
Yes, she makes fun of their hats for being ugly.
Yes. But I'm telling you, when I am in the field with you, especially if we're in a big group and I am looking for you, I look for your hat and I can always find you, Tristan.
And I will tell you, straw hats are the best. They're
I'm
cool,
not knocking them.
They're great.
But she also talked
But
about
no one else wears them.
the shorthand that we develop, and it made me think of your twaddler.
Not mine. Hold on. That needs a little context there.
So, not Tristan's twaddler.
Right.
So, a twaddler. When we were working on this battlefield site, we were using metal detectors. And when our large handheld metal detector that you guys are familiar with, seeing people on the beach use and things like that, when that hit on something, we would use a very small metal detector that looked like almost like a magic wand, essentially, just to kind of identify more directly where the object was in the soil. And Tristan took up calling it a twaddler. And so you'd hear Tristan, hey, does anybody have a twaddler I could borrow? Or, and it just kind of caught on. And so when she was talking about the shorthand that archaeologists develop when working with each other, twaddler immediately came to mind.
And that's gone national now, apparently. So
I love it. I love it.
the first time she comes out to the site, she walks up to them in the morning. They've already been working for a little while. And she hears the archaeologist say, ugh, what is this? Which I thought, perfect. How often are you digging and you find something you don't expect and it's like, what am I looking at? What is going on? There's literally the line, I have never seen anything like this, which that's so good.
Yep.
That's a good way of summarizing a lot of archaeology.
But I feel like in my experience, something like that always happens at the end of the day when you're trying to wrap up and then you have to like delineate it or something. And you're like,
or at the end of the project, you're like,
yes.
I have like 3 hours to figure out what this is.
Yes.
So continuing with her descriptions of the excavation that was going on, this is actually in some ways kind of some of my favorite. I liked the way she presented the archaeology and described it, a very good and relatable way of talking about a lot of these things, which is not always easy to do.
And I can tell she enjoyed the experience too.
Yes, definitely. So I thought there was a few things that were interesting in the way things were described. One was the soil was scooped into buckets and pushed through a sieve later to catch any remaining items. And so I'm like, is she talking about screening? Or is she talking about water screening or even flotation in this case?
I'm going to assume screening
Just
because
regular
I've
screening.
had other people call it a sieve or, yeah.
Okay.
Not archaeologists, but like members of the public. That's
Okay.
just what they don't know our terminology.
Right. Probably just regular screening. Okay. That actually explains that for me. And then as another minor terminology snafu that archaeologists would not use, they would chunk out the first 30 centimeters of the soil because basically that's all disturbed by plowing and they know that. So they need to get to the stuff that's less disturbed. The author calls that first 30 centimeters as sterile.
Right. Yeah.
Which to us, that means basically you are below any human habitation.
Right.
So it is not the same in archaeological speak. It's not a big deal, but I just thought that was kind of interesting.
Usually I've always called that the plow zone.
Plow zone. Yeah. disturbed, plow zone, just plow zone.
But sterile layer, it means like you're not finding any cultural remains. So it would be below, it would be deep, not
The
near the surface.
soil is older than human existence, basically.
Yeah.
Talks about the digging techniques, which again, this is really good as a specialized craft, which it definitely is. It is a skill you have to learn, and how students were learning on the job, and kind of talks about the intense focus that's involved in dealing with things. Again, that's something that goes all the way back to, I think, our first episode with the dig, talking about how people get almost hypnotized, just kind of focusing on what you're doing, and everything else is kind of blocked out. And that's something else. Someone else is observing that same phenomenon, basically. Using shovels with sharpened edges, you do shovel scraping, which I would always call it skimming. Again, it's a minor thing, but I could see other archaeologists call it scraping too.
Yeah,
but
I've heard both, I think.
Essentially, you're using a flat shovel, so not like a round shovel you'd use for digging a hole. And you're taking off a centimeter or even a half centimeter at a time, very, very carefully. And you can feel the difference between when you hit different soils. You actually get a sense for like, I've hit a rock. You can feel that when you hit it. It's interesting how you can develop that kind of thing. And they're observing the same thing here. Oh, and then the bones.
I love this part.
Yeah.
Do you want me to
go for
tackle it? All right. So bones are porous, whereas other objects archaeologists might come across aren't, like some ceramics and stuff like that. Well, and I really appreciate the author's enthusiasm here.
Yeah.
But one of the things we do to check for whether an object is bone is to stick it on our tongues. She refers to it as the lick check.
Yep.
If it's porous, it's going to stick on your tongue because it's absorbing some of the moisture from your tongue, essentially. And one of the students does this, and I think she's kind of just taken aback and I've had other people that I've spoken to, members of the public, and they're like, you do what?
Yeah.
And yes, we do it. Tristan, have you licked a bone?
Oh, 100%.
Yes, me too.
I'll note that like every professor I've had says, don't do this, and then they do it.
I know. Yeah. Right.
So.
Yeah. But one of I think it was a student, kind of asks her, if she wants to give it a try. And I love the quote in the book where she's like, would the weird journalist do it? Hell yeah, I would.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate her enthusiasm for it. And one of the things I liked about it was, she's really enjoying herself. And I think as archaeologists, oftentimes we forget how cool this is and how cool just archaeology in general is. Like she says, I wish I would have been there for the party 900 years ago, but this may be the next best thing.
Right.
And we get so used to finding the artifacts and finding the features and getting mesmerized and getting in that methodological kind of frame of mind. And I think sometimes we forget just
having a fresh perspective.
Yeah, just how cool archaeology is. I mean, you are potentially handling something that hasn't been handled for hundreds or thousands of years. And that's just such a cool thing to experience. And I just loved her enthusiasm. And I love that she kind of got that, right? It clicked for her. It kind of brought back my enthusiasm because when you're out there in the Florida heat getting carried away by mosquitoes and you go home with poison ivy and chigger bites around your ankles, sometimes you're like, what am I doing this for?
And you've been doing this for years.
Yeah.
Like anything, it becomes a job sometimes, and you have to step back and like, wait a minute. Okay.
Yeah.
This is what is going on. It's actually really cool. It's actually really important.
Yeah.
Keep that in mind. Yeah.
So it was just kind of a nice, refreshing little aha moment for me.
Yep.
One thing I also wanted to mention was a lot of times with archaeological sites, especially in museums and things like that, they do artistic renderings of the site, whether it's paintings or, those little 3D model maps and things. And oftentimes they're covered in grass and they're, pristine looking little meadows and stuff like that. And you're like, wait, but I thought like 30,000 people lived here.
Right.
How is grass growing? Like I have 2 dogs in my backyard and grass isn't growing. So I'm like 30,000 people. But she talks about how oftentimes, these artistic renderings have this grass and stuff like that. And there's ones of Cahokia that have it depicted like that. And you can just Google Cahokia and they all pop up.
Yep.
But they weren't covered in grass. They were bald. They were made of, this black mud where grass couldn't have grown. And the houses would have been colorful and decorated and carvings everywhere and these wooden poles and things like that. So I think when we look at these sites, and I've seen some museums do a very good job of this and others not so much. So, it depends on what you're looking at, essentially. But I think it's important to remember that these were colorful and vibrant communities, essentially. They weren't this pristine kind of idyllic, grass waving in the wind kind of situation.
And that's a really good point, because that's all the depictions I've seen are of that, and I had just never considered it. And if you go to see them now, they're covered in grass, right? So of course they wouldn't be, though. It just had never even occurred to me to think about that.
And
so I
I've
really
been,
appreciate it.
like, a lot of mounds here in Florida, especially in our area, now have trees growing on them. And they keep the trees growing on them because the root system helps stabilize the structure and keep it from, eroding. And you'll also see a lot of like brambles, blackberries and stuff like that growing on it. And people often, I was talking to some park rangers and they're like, why don't you mow it? And he's like, because then you're going to climb on it.
Yeah.
So if there's blackberries all over it, you're not going to climb all over it and it's going to be preserved better. So even some things like that, even though they're not accurate, they serve a purpose and they're intentional. Just when you visit these sites, it's important to kind of understand that what you're seeing is not what they necessarily looked like, 1,000 years ago or whatever.
And I like the descriptions of what things were decorated with. And I was kind of playing at least a game in my head of like, okay, how would we know this? So like houses were decorated with mats and plasters. Like, okay, we could find the plaster. And I bet we found impression of the mats, right? I'm not so sure about carvings. That's an interesting one. I'm not sure I have an answer to. But then I like the idea of so they're wooden poles in public places. We'll know that because of the post holes in the plazas. And they were possibly decorated with fur, feathers, baskets, grain, and other symbolic items. But we also know that definitely had some mica and ochre decoration on it because we found that around the base of where these poles were. I'm like, that's cool. That's the kind of evidence that they're like, okay, you got good stuff there. And so we move into kind of what archaeologists at least define as some of the different phases of Cahokia. So we've got the first phase, about 1050 to 1100. This is where everything is oriented around the mounds and the courtyards like we were talking about. And then the middle phase, or the classic peak, which we've talked about, how that's really not an accurate way of describing it, is when things shift to being aligned to a north-south grid. This goes for about 100 years. And then the post-classic peak is where the city goes back to that courtyard layout. And she makes an argument that this marks societal change, which that seems reasonable. There's got to be some changes that's pretty dramatic, and very quick, I guess, too.
Yeah.
But then we get into kind of some of the leadership that I was talking about, where I struggle a little bit with some of the contrast between that and some of the other depictions of how this culture might have worked. And so essentially leaders motivated this, at least, lived on top of the mound. And during the end of the peak phase, there must have been a lot of unrest, which there's no evidence presented of that.
I have issues with this, Tristan, because there is no archaeological evidence that I found. I did like a quick Google search and stuff of any unrest at Cahokia. So I don't know. And also, she doesn't really define very well what she means by unrest.
Yeah, the implication seems to be violent.
Right.
But if there was violent unrest, we would find some indication of that somewhere.
Yeah. I almost feel like she's just trying to wrap it up.
Yeah. Yeah, so it just kind of raised some alarm bells for me, I guess. Because there are other reasons you can see such a dramatic change that doesn't involve unrest.
Well, and then she goes, so yeah, it could have been environmental. It could have been just they moved on for, political reasons, whatever. But I thought it was interesting that she goes on, talking about unrest, but then she starts talking about the book Collapse by Jared Diamond and criticizing that for its theories on why civilizations collapse or whatever.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what she alluded to when she was talking about the unrest in some ways.
She's a lot better off than that is, I would say.
Oh, yeah. But I'm just saying, like...
But there's some flaws in the way it's being presented, I guess.
Yeah.
So the problem with Collapse, if I understood this right, I haven't read the book, is that it presented a whole bunch of cultures as having died out because of environmental problems,
Right.
which that's the whole premise of this book, is that these cultures did not die out and the cities didn't die. They just changed.
Yeah.
And the end of this as a like huge population center is not necessarily a failure, right? And environment alone wasn't apparently ever enough to end these cultures. It always needed some kind of political problem, which actually that could explain why she's keying in on the unrest in Cahokia, because
But again, you need evidence of that. You can't
Yeah.
just say that.
but it's also established that this was, or she also argues that this was intended to be temporary from the start.
Yeah.
And if that's the case,
Then there doesn't need to be
then it
unrest.
doesn't need to be a political unrest,
And
right?
I think this is an important thing to kind of point out. It's okay not to know the answer.
Right.
Uh,
And it's okay to talk about possibilities.
right.
But this is kind of where I started, I think, figure this out, where some of my issues were, because sometimes things are presented as possibilities, but there's no alternative possibility presented
Yeah.
at the same time or close together. And I feel like that then essentially, even though it's like this is a way it may have happened, but you present only one option, then that is almost arguing that that is the way it happened. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I mean, you kind of have to present the other side. Otherwise,
Or at least
you're-
allude to it,
yeah.
even if you don't want
yeah.
to go into detail.
Otherwise, I think you're kind of counteracting what you're trying to
Yeah.
accomplish in some ways. Yeah, sometimes I just feel like she's kind of maybe grasping at straws that don't exist.
There was a quote towards the end of this, though, because if you remember, I had a little trouble understanding how Pompeii fit into the overall scope of the book, right?
Right.
Because the idea was like the cities didn't die; they changed to something else. But she has urban abandonment does not lead to social collapse. People are resilient, and our culture can survive volcanoes and floods, even if our cities don't. Like, oh, okay, so that actually I think is the core premise of the book. Not so much that the cities don't die, but the people and the culture exists in maybe in some other form, but they still continue, right?
Yeah.
So okay, that like was a good way of wrapping that idea up right there.
Well, I know she talks a little bit about the decline of the use of the Grand Plaza and that she equates that to political rebellion.
Yeah.
And I don't really know, and maybe you have a better understanding of this than I do, but I don't understand how the abandonment of a specific place within a settlement would lead one to believe that it's due to political rebellion.
Nope.
I mean, the only thing I could think of is, okay, so people gathered there when like the leader was speaking out when he was, was on top of the mound or whatever, or there were ceremonies and things like that. But that also could mean there was nobody at the mound speaking. So why would you gather at the plaza? You know what I'm saying? So it's not, I don't like without knowing the rest of the story, I don't think you can make that assumption.
Yeah. No, I felt like that was a little difficult to accept. And again, especially because part of the premise too is that the organization was very different from how we would imagine a very top-down city structure. That's been established in the previous chapter, and now the argument is very much this was a top-down organization with elites managing things, and it seems to conflict, at least from what I'm understanding. Unless I'm missing something, but I don't understand quite what I'd be missing there. Unless she's talking about specific periods, but doesn't specify which period she's talking about always. That's the only thing I can think of that could explain that.
Well, even if she's talking about specific periods, it doesn't really fit because the only period that would really matter when discussing the downfall of the city or like it becoming lost would be the last period.
Yeah,
right?
because it lasted for another 150 years, was it?
Yeah.
After this, yeah.
So,
Yeah. So that was the end of what is classically considered the peak, was actually the halfway marker for the city's existence. It lasted for another 150 years after that.
Yeah. She leans into the whole like questioning authority thing pretty hard, considering there's no evidence for that. And I mean, maybe there is more evidence than what she mentions. I didn't really dig too deeply into it, but
it wasn't presented in the book as well, which is...
Yeah. And I did do like a cursory kind of Google search and there really wasn't anything I could find. But then what blew my mind And then she goes on to compare it with the BLM protesters.
Yeah.
And I was like, say what? Because there's no evidence of any protest or political unrest or anything like that. So I thought it was quite the stretch. And I know maybe she's just trying to make a connection between like people of the past and what's happening today. But that's
And the idea that there's any parallel, even if there was political protest or some form, the idea that there's any real parallel between that and any current protest there's no reason to do that.
Yeah. That I found almost as problematic as the way she discusses the sacrifices and things like that with the Native Americans. I feel like you just have to be very careful about comparisons you make when discussing other cultures.
Especially cultures that have been historically poorly treated.
Yeah.
Well, currently still, you'd say, too. So moving on to last chapter, we're back to describing some of her experience working with the crew. In this case, packing up the shelter and running to shelter because there's a big storm warning. Although I feel like she's intentionally being dramatic in her storytelling, but while trees are being uprooted elsewhere, we're sitting in a cafe. It's like, really? Basically, you've got a tornado and you're sitting in a restaurant eating dinner? I don't think I would be sitting by windows, speaking as the Midwesterner. But I think maybe it was just being a little dramatic for the storytelling.
Well, and also coming, in Tallahassee, we have a lot of trees that just uproot because the ground is saturated.
Yeah.
They have shallow roots like oak trees and stuff. So that could have been the case. But yeah, it seemed a little overly dramatic.
Made me nervous. And I wasn't even there. So, and then she asked who lived on top of the mounds. And the archaeologists kind of say there's no real solid answer. There's probably no single leader.
And can I say, I really appreciate the archaeologists kind of saying, I don't know.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of times people expect us to know everything about everything, and archaeology is a process, and it's a process of inquiry. We don't have all the answers. And sometimes when we do an excavation, it actually leads to more questions than answers. And that is perfectly okay. That's part of the process. And so I appreciate them just being like, yeah, we don't know.
But then we get back to the kind of where I was having issue with the idea of kind of a totalitarian leadership elites, because we get to the idea of a hierarchy where you have kind of different groups making decisions and governing themselves. And maybe I'm lacking a full understanding of what that entails, but that doesn't sound like you'd have elites keeping all the goods to themselves and everything to protest against. Right? I feel like we're flip-flopping between the two, and there's no warning that, okay, now we're going to explore this idea, now we're going to explore this idea.
I think...
Maybe that's what she's doing, though?
Maybe, but I think it's also emblematic of the fact that we just don't know.
Yeah.
And I think that's why...
Maybe there's some pressure to kind of present a narrative still.
Yeah, we just don't know.
Right.
And so maybe she's kind of grappling with that a little bit.
Right. Like we are.
Yeah.
Okay. Well-worded quote. In the 1960s, when scientists were in the habit of digging up Native American ancestors without permission, that's a good way of putting that. And again, it's getting better. It's something we're still grappling with and dealing with the after effects with. But
I do appreciate the fact that she actually calls out the name of the archaeologist that does that.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously,
it wasn't
in the 1960s. I don't know if he's still even around.
Right. It wasn't okay then. There are people who didn't do that, but there just wasn't the laws preventing you from doing that, essentially. There wasn't you needed regulations on how what's expected of you. So I'm glad we have that stuff now, even though it has its weaknesses. You may remember us talking about repatriation of Native American artifacts is still going on. And there's still a lot of arguments about that. So it's not a resolved issue by any means, but at least there's some laws on how this has to be dealt with.
Yeah, and there's an awareness that it needs to be dealt with.
Right.
And that Native Americans deserve a say in how their ancestral belongings and remains are treated. And that used to not exist. So we are moving in the right direction. Definitely not perfect, though.
And then we move back into the human sacrifices again.
I know.
And we could talk about what's observed in these, but I'm not sure how I feel about doing that, honestly. Not that I'm squeamish about it, but
I don't know that it's necessary. I mean, you can read the book, but it
doesn't matter to what she's trying to say. Although she does tie this back into why there was apparently unrest against the elites because the elites were sacrificing too many people. And as we've talked about, we can't say that's what was going on.
And I think they found 50 something individual human remains in a population of 30,000 or whatever it was at that time. That's really not a lot.
Yeah.
And
you think about it, like, that doesn't necessarily mean sacrifices. They could have just died naturally for other reasons, and this was part of the ritual, for all we know at this point. Now, there are some that have been interpreted as sacrifice, but not all of them still.
Right, yeah. And
just because it's sacrifice doesn't mean it was people being drugged to it.
And the whole punishment aspect, you can't say, I know there are instances where, cultures would take prisoners and sacrifice them and things like that. But we don't know that was happening here. And honestly, with isotope analysis showing that people were from all over the place, we can't really determine much of anything.
Right.
Unless there's actual physical evidence on the human remains that indicates that it was a sacrifice. Or that it was involuntary, you're just kind of speculating. And I feel like speculating about sacrifice is it's a really sensitive subject. I don't know that it's something you need to be speculating about.
Not without evidence or presenting that you have evidence for that speculation.
And then
at
to
least
say that it's like a public execution, which implicates punishment.
Right.
But then you say it's ceremonial. There's just a lot of conflicting, and not that you.
And she didn't necessarily mean it as, and if I remember this right, it wasn't intended as this was a punishment. It was more of a, like public execution, this is political leaders demonstrating their power.
Right.
But again, it still has the same problems.
Yeah. It's, I'm just going to need more evidence,
And again, some of that might exist. I strongly suspect not all of it is very strongly supported here. I don't know.
I'm just doing a quick precursory Google search.
Sure.
There's some articles online that talk about it, but a lot of these sources I've never even heard of. So I would have to do a real deep dive to be convinced of this.
And regardless of whether or not this is supported, I feel like if you're going to talk about it and it is supported, you need to present or at least allude to the fact that this comes from somewhere specific, right? Which it does. First time we talk about some of this, there is some references and like, this is what this source said. But a lot of times it felt like, where does this come from? Where are we getting this? And and I have a note here that unlike with maybe Cahokia, this becomes a lot more problematic when there are living cultural descendants of this group of people, where, especially like you said, where things like this practice have been used as tools to justify atrocities done to them.
Yep. Yeah. You just have to be really, really, really careful.
And I feel like we just feel very uncomfortable with this, as you can tell. Then we move next into a discussion of a lot of the symbolism involved in the sites and in the artifacts found. And there's a lot of very good and interesting information. I think the best way of observing that is to read it yourself if you want to. But it talks about, upper worlds and lower worlds and how they interact with each other. And part of the reason I like this part in particular is because I felt like it was very well grounded in modern Native American belief systems. I feel like it was based off of work that was pulled from that kind of thing. It seemed like very well backed up.
Yeah, and from my experience, a lot of what modern Native Americans believe is really, really, you see a strong correlation between what we see in the archaeological record as far as iconography and things like that. And it's just fascinating. If you ever have the chance to read some Native American stories or myths, definitely do it. They're beautiful and just gives you a whole new perspective on the world. So I highly, highly recommend it.
Talking about another site, in 2013, there was a highway construction where they found what at least initially appeared like a neighborhood, but it existed entirely for ritual burning. I thought, this is cool. This is the first we found of this for this culture, as I understood it. And so they found charred mats, which they knew from impressions left in the clay. and which, as we've talked about, is extremely rare. And actually, if you go back to the dig as well, we talk about how amazing it was that the archaeologists at the time were able to excavate the shape of the ship so carefully. That was amazing. And this is a similar case of that, where they have through very, very careful excavation, have been able to uncover the soil in such a way that they can actually see the impressions of the
little houses and stuff
grass
that
mats
were,
or
yeah,
whatever they're using to make the mats out of. Yeah.
yeah. But it was like all burned in effigy, and it just,
It existed to do that.
yeah,
It's so fascinating.
yeah. It would be really cool to even just see some pictures of the excavation to see what was going on there, because as an archaeologist, I'm always wondering in my mind, what would I do if I came across this? What would I think? Would I notice it? I feel like an archaeologist's worst nightmare is excavating and not realizing that they're like excavating through something that's significant,
Hmm.
and they think it's just like a tree root or something like that. So I'm like, I need to know what this looks like just in case I come across it.
So next we move into kind of talking about the end of Cahokia. It apparently had a revitalization movement before its abandonment in 1400. I assume we can see this through maybe an increase in population or something. I don't think it was very clear on how we know that.
No, it wasn't. I mean, I assume there's something in the archaeological record that would indicate that, though.
The book lists multiple possibilities for why this could have happened, but it's basically listed in such a way, it's like, well, I think this kind of means we don't really know. It could be practically anything, is how I kind of ultimately interpreted that. But a bunch of things were rebuilt rapidly. And one thing I thought was kind of cool was, particularly in this time, I guess, they were finding a lot of woodland culture artifacts, which were kept as treasured items, I think is the phrasing. That's probably a good phrasing, because we don't know, was this sacred? Was this a curiosity? I don't know that
Right.
we know that for sure, but treasured item is a good way of putting that.
And again, it like brings in the human aspect, right? Like, I mean, we're archaeologists. Obviously, we're drawn to items from the past, right?
Right.
So that's a very human thing. And, antiquing, we love to antique. Well, maybe the people of Cahokia did too. you So I thought it was really cool because I had never really thought about, we find multi component sites where you find one time period on top of another, on top of another. But I can't think of an instance where I've ever even thought about a site that contained items that were owned by the people and used by the people that were actually from previous time periods. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
Like, I think that's pretty cool
Yeah.
and possibly quite unique.
Especially as a pattern.
Yeah.
Like, we'll find something out of place sometimes, and it's the thought that must have been that purpose, but this seemed like it was a pattern of more than just like
Yeah.
one or two edge cases.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just very interesting to me.
Yeah. And then why the site was ultimately abandoned is, again, pretty much unknown. There's some thought that it may have been a series of floods, but this seems like kind of iffy. They talk about a geomorphologist that was brought in, which I thought is very
I
cool.
know.
We've had some on site occasionally.
I was like, yes, multidisciplinary approach.
Right. So a geomorphologist is someone who studies soils and how they deposit and everything. And the geomorphologist didn't find any evidence of massive floods, because that would have a lot of deposited soils and things.
But they did find evidence of drought,
Yes.
which is kind of interesting and makes you wonder if that may have had something that, or may have been something that contributed.
Well, and if a belief system is tied to the land and then there's droughts, what that means exactly is hard to say, but you could see how there could be some connection with, maybe it's time we get out of here.
Yeah.
You
And
know?
I know here in Tallahassee, Lake Jackson, which is located next to Lake Jackson mounds, which are actually Mississippian mounds as well. There's a sinkhole at the bottom of the lake. And so occasionally the lake drains completely. And there's been a lot of speculation in Tallahassee about whether or not that happened and that's what caused people to abandon Lake Jackson. Now, I don't know that there's any evidence of it. I've talked to my professors that taught me about this, and there doesn't seem to be any way to really know that for sure. But so it's something that we talk about when it comes to other sites, not just Cahokia as well.
Sure. And then we move into a section titled Survivance. So this is kind of where we start to tie Cahokia and kind of establish, I think, very, very nicely that this is not the end of this culture, right? So there are actually existing Native American groups today where a study of the language has found ties to Cahokia, which is fascinating.
I know I think I've told you my horror story of linguistic anthropology. It was one of my hardest classes in undergrad, but the study of language from like an anthropological perspective. And it's just cool because that's something I think we take for granted and we don't necessarily consider. I mean, in the modern context, we think, oh yeah, different cultures speak different languages, but
There's so much more to it than that.
yeah.
It's even not just to like other cultures, but how does our culture communicate its language use, and how does that language use shift over time, and how do we, is there tension between different groups? There's all kinds
Yeah.
of stuff going on with language, and it's incredibly complicated, and it's fascinating, and I'm glad I didn't take that class myself.
Yeah, you
I
are.
think I would have struggled a lot too.
I struggled. It
Yeah.
was really, really hard, but it was interesting.
So I find it fascinating as well. There's also the figure called Redhorn, which I'm not very familiar with this. I don't know if you have run into it before, Barbara.
I have not.
Okay.
This was the first I had heard of it.
But this is a figure that appears pretty frequently in Cahokian art. And then the Sioux tribe in particular tells legends involving the Redhorn figure. And it may have originated with Cahokia, but there's some evidence, I guess. It's not clarified where the evidence is, but it may have originated with a woodland culture as well. And then there are some modern inclusions with so how it influences people today. In particular, there's an author they cite that is writing stories about, or a story at least about Cahokia and how they would interpret it and that kind of thing. That might be worth adding to our list. It didn't seem very archaeology focused though, so maybe not.
No, I mean, I would be interested in reading it. I always enjoy when artists and, even performance artists and things try to incorporate archaeology and history into their pieces or their performances. Even if it's not historically accurate, at least it kind of creates awareness and gets people curious about it.
I mean, that was kind of our take on the dig as well, right?
Yeah, yeah.
There's a lot of liberties taken, but there was a lot of very good stuff, and it was what good way presenting that narrative.
Yeah.
And so then survivance, this is a term I hadn't heard of before.
Same. Yeah.
I wish I had, because I feel like I should have. But it's described as an active sense of presence, the continuation of native stories, not a mere reaction or a survivable name. Native survivance stories are reunifications of dominance, tragedy, and victimry. And I don't know what else to say about that, except I don't know what else to say about that.
I think it's I think it's fascinating. I think it's really kind of a cool concept. And she goes on to say, we may not know exactly what Cahokia meant to the people who lived there, but their traditions thrive in revitalized communities reconfigured in the wake of political disaster that was European colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that kind of sums it up pretty well, too. These cultures aren't gone. There are still people today that practice at least versions of this, culture or like these belief systems that derive from these ancient sites. And so it's just really important to remember that these people have not been completely wiped from the map.
Right.
And I really think that's at the heart of what survivance is just kind of.
I think that's the heart of what the book is trying to communicate.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really good thing, and I think it's presented very well.
Yeah. And I think it's really important for people to understand that. I like a little bit of her discussion at the very end about how, we can learn from the past. And I mean, as you've heard me say, I'm like, I don't know that we really do. I wish we did. But I think she presents the information in such a way that we can. It makes it accessible to the reader.
Yep. So finally move on to an epilogue where the author kind of brings it all back and kind of brings it back to modern day, looking at the modern cities and kind of some of the struggles they're experiencing involving environment or political unrest or both, and wondering kind of what is our future like. And I think that's important to do because archaeology and anthropology, these things don't just exist in the past. They are ongoing today, which is kind of the theme of the book as well. Is the observation that we can see this pattern of expansion and abandonment in many cities, and we can see it maybe happening today even in some cities. And I wonder if like current transportation and communication would actually speed up or slow down that process even. Just kind of, I don't think we know at this point, or you and I definitely don't.
And I could see it going either way.
Right. But the author talks about, how we might figure all this out and we might kind of manage to keep working with the environment and kind of level out politically and keep everything together. I feel like that's a little optimistic, sadly, but it's a nice thought. Yeah.
But I thought it ended really well.
It did.
I think I think it's important to think of cities as these kind of almost like organisms, right? They have this kind of ebb and flow and they change and the people within them change, especially today, right? We live in a global economy essentially, but cultures and traditions do survive. And the city is just one aspect of that culture. And of course, as archaeologists, it's the one we come across, right? It's the one that's left for us to excavate. But I think it kind of brings itself around to the fact that like there were people living in the city and the people made the city. And this is what the city meant to these people and how they survived. And so it brings she does a good job of kind of unintentionally maybe, but like kind of bringing it back around to archaeology is about the people.
I guess that was probably maybe not the primary point, but
Right.
I thought the core premise was, even though it took me a little while to kind of figure out exactly how to define that core premise, I thought it was pretty well established from the start now that I look back, and pretty well supported throughout a lot of the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just thought it was interesting because specifically with Pompeii, like I thought I knew pretty much everything there was to know about Pompeii as a member of the general public.
Mhm.
I'm not an archaeologist that specializes in that. And I learned so much that I had never learned before about Pompeii. And she does a really good job of just presenting these cities in a different kind of framework that even if somebody did know Pompeii, like, yeah, we know about Pompeii, like it's cool. But we were able to learn something new, which I think is great and probably kind of hard to do. And I also loved her enthusiasm for learning about this stuff and talking to the archaeologists and just kind of licking bone and doing all the cool things she did. Like her enthusiasm really shows through and her passion for it.
And I want to reiterate that while we were very critical of certain aspects of the book, I think part of reason those things bothered me so much is because the book is so darn good in so many ways. And then it just has a few faults that really bothered me.
Yeah.
I guess.
I mean, overall, I loved this book and I've already recommended it to a lot of my friends, and I have a lot of friends following our podcast that have bought the book and are reading along. So, I mean, I would read this book again. I think it would be nice to read it again as someone who's not taking notes for the podcast and things like that. Just somebody who can sit there with a cup of coffee and enjoy the book. There's a lot to unpack and there's a lot to really kind of contemplate that I think is important for us to contemplate too.
So that wraps up Four Lost Cities. For our next book, Barbara and I are going to do a blast to the past, for us at least. We're going to read a book called In Small Things Forgotten: An Archaeology of Early American Life by James Deetz. And this is about, I think it is the first archaeology book I ever read. And I am looking forward to going back to this because it was way back when I was just starting archaeology. And it presented a lot of archaeology ideas in a very clear and engaging way, I remember. And we'll find out if that holds true still or not.
I know I'm excited to read this book because like you, it's been so long. I feel like it's going to appear to be a new book to me. So I'm excited.
Friends, in case you are considering following along, I did have way back when my dad read through this and he really liked it as well. So I can attest that even if you're not an archaeologist, it is a pretty engaging book. So this book has 9 chapters, and we have decided to read through the first 3 chapters for this first section. So that is to about page 88.
And I will note, I somehow lost my copy of it, so I had to go and purchase another one online, and it was only like $16. I will say I couldn't find an electronic copy of it. That's something to consider, although your library or something might have one. But it is a very affordable and accessible book. Mm-hmm. So just something to consider because I know books can be expensive.
Right. I think that wraps up this episode of Archaeology Books for Fun. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time with the new book.
Bye, everybody.
Archaeology Books for Fun is brought to you by the Florida Public Archaeology Network, a program of the University of West Florida. You can find out more about archaeology and about FPAN at fpan.us. We appreciate any feedback, so if you're listening to us as a podcast, please leave us a review. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Thanks for listening.